Hey YouTube theologians, it's Teaching Christian Basics, lesson 31. Haha! The threefold suffering of Jesus. You're gonna like this. Boom. We want to dig into the suffering of Jesus, and then next we're going to talk about the work of Jesus proper, what he's accomplished, the language of the gospel, and so forth. But let's start with talking about the suffering of Jesus and how, or I suppose in what way, it wins for us salvation. Now, we want to recognize three kinds or levels or ways that Jesus suffered for us on the cross. The physical suffering of the cross, the shame of the cross, and then the atoning suffering of God's wrath. First, the physical suffering. That's normally what we think of. If you've seen like the Passion of the Christ or pictures of the crucifix, you're thinking, man, that looks like it hurts. And that's right. It does hurt. The Romans invented a crucifixion to be a torture. Normally, crucifixion would last for days. You would hang there on the cross. You'd have the nails either through here, or if it's through your hand, it rips through. So they tie you and nail you through the hand, and so you're hanging there, and your arms are out of joint, and the way you die is by asphyxiation. The fluid fills up your lungs and puts so much pressure on your heart that your heart can't beat anymore, and you die of a heart attack. But after a long time, I mean, it takes forever for that to come to pass, for the death by crucifixion to occur. That's why, remember when the three guys were crucified next to Jesus, they had to break the legs of the other two so they couldn't lift themselves up to breathe. So Romans invented this death by crucifixion as a torture device. And not only to mention that, but Jesus was whipped. By his stripes we are healed. Those stripes are the whip marks across his back. He was beaten. He had his beard pulled out. He couldn't recognize him, Isaiah says, because he was so beat up. He was mauled beyond resemblance. They couldn't recognize him. He was so beat up. So this is physical suffering. But here's the point: is this physical suffering save us? The two guys who died next to Jesus had the same kind of physical suffering. If physical suffering could save us, then we could have a bunch of physical suffering ourselves and be saved, somehow redeem ourselves. So the physical suffering is not all that there was. The main suffering that the Gospels hone in on is the second kind of suffering, and that's the shame of the cross. Hebrews says that Jesus endured the cross despising the shame. Amazing language. The shame of the cross had to do with the mockery, the being blindfolded and beaten on the head with a stick. They blindfolded him and they struck him. They said, "Prophesy, who struck you?" He had the purple robes on and the staff, and they bowed down and said, "Hail, King of the Jews." He was stripped, either down to his undergarments or stripped all the way. We don't know exactly. It seems like the Romans had given the Jewish people a provision for modesty even during crucifixion. We don't know if it was exercised that day or not, but we know that they were gambling for his garments, for his undergarments. It's a great shame. In fact, to get at the difference between physical suffering and shame, this question I ask whenever I'm talking about this with a group. I'll say, who would rather be punched in the face? If you had two choices, you're punched in the face or stripped naked right now here in this group. Who chooses punched in the face? And it's almost 100% would rather be punched in the face than stripped. That's because physical suffering is not, in fact, as bad as the suffering of shame. This Adam and Eve in their nakedness. Perhaps the worst shame is that Jesus was mocked by the men crucified next to him, by the people walking by wagging their heads, by the Jewish leaders, by the Roman soldiers. They said, he saved others, let him save himself. He trusted in God, let God deliver him. Jesus endured the cross, despising the shame. But if that's not bad enough, the physical suffering and the shame, there's a third suffering which is profound. Much more than we can even fathom. And that's the suffering of God's wrath. This is Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Because he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, so that Jesus became sin for us. The one who was righteous became sin, so that he becomes despicable to God. despised by God, forsaken by God, Psalm 22, and stricken and smitten by God, Isaiah 53. That Jesus is made an object of God's curse. Cursed is he who hangs on a tree, and an object of God's wrath. So that Jesus is suffering in place of sinners. This is the vicarious satisfaction, the substitutionary atonement. That Jesus is in our place suffering what you and I deserve. Now, as we reflect on the threefold suffering of Christ, we recognize that we can know something about physical suffering and we can know something about shame, but it's precisely this third kind of suffering that Jesus is enduring so that we never will. So that you never will. Jesus never wants you ever to cry, my God, why have you forsaken me? That cry of dereliction, the cry of condemnation, the cry of hell itself. He cries it so that we never will. So there's the threefold suffering of Christ.